The first week after D-Day was a time of momentum, uncertainty, and frantic calculation on both sides of the Normandy front. Allied forces had secured the beaches, but the deeper objectives, the towns, crossroads, and high ground that controlled inland movement, were still fiercely contested. One such objective towered above all others in the British sector, the city of Caen, the hinge of Normandy's interior road network and an essential gateway for any major breakout. As June 13th dawned, the British Second Army faced a paradox. They had landed successfully, established supply lines, and pushed several miles inland. Yet Caen, the prize meant to fall on D-Day itself, remained out of reach. The city was heavily defended by veteran German units, and the landscape between the British positions and Caen was broken by hedgerows, ridges, and narrow roads, terrain that favored defenders. Capturing Caen required more than brute force. It demanded maneuver, deception, and speed. This is where Operation Perch emerged. Rather than continue battering directly into the German defensive line, British command identified an opportunity. The American advance farther west had forced German units to realign, creating a temporary gap in the defensive screen. That gap, if exploited quickly, could allow British armor to swing around to the south of Caen, threatening the German flank and perhaps forcing a withdrawal without a bloody urban battle. To execute this bold maneuver, the task fell to one of the most experienced and mobile armored forces in the British arsenal, the 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats. Seasoned by years of fighting in North Africa, they were accustomed to rapid advances and fast-moving operations. If any unit could seize the moment and race deep behind enemy lines, it was them. Their immediate goal was a modest French town nestled among orchards and hedgerows, Villers-Bocage. On a map, it might seem insignificant, a cluster of streets and stone buildings along a single road. But to the planners, it represented a doorway. Beyond Villers-Bocage lay Point 213, a ridge overlooking the countryside to the east. British armored columns capturing that ridge would sit directly on the flank of German positions guarding Caen. The psychological and strategic impact would be immense. For the British crews preparing to move out on the morning of June 13th, there was a sense that they were on the cusp of a breakthrough. The early stages of the advance reinforced this belief. Reconnaissance units reported patchy German resistance. The roads leading south from their assembly areas were narrow and hemmed in by hedgerows, but they were open. As the columns assembled, the Cromwell tanks of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, the motorized riflemen in carriers, the armoured cars and Stuarts. The operation felt like the beginning of something decisive. By mid-morning, the lead elements rolled into Villers-Bocage itself. To their surprise, the town was quiet, not abandoned, but thinly held. A few German scouts melted away as British tanks clattered into the main square. Civilians peered from windows and doorways. Some waved hesitantly, others simply stared. After days of uncertainty, the sudden arrival of British armor felt abrupt, unexpected, almost surreal. For a moment there was an air of calm, of possibility. British commanders moved quickly. The key was the ridge beyond the town. If they could secure Point 213 before German reserves arrived, they would anchor the entire left hook of Operation Perch. A squadron of the 4th CLY was ordered to push east out of Villers-Bocage and seize the high ground. The Rifle Brigade's infantry accompanied them, riding in the backs of carriers and trucks. From the perspective of those crews, the mission seemed straightforward. Advance up the rising ground, occupy it, and await further orders. The column stretched out along the road, Cromwell's leading, carriers following close behind. They passed tall hedges, sloping fields, and wooded patches that obscured long sightlines. The Normandy countryside, so different from the expanses of the desert where many of these men had fought before, formed a maze of green walls and hidden corners. It was beautiful, but tactically treacherous. Still, everything suggested the British were ahead of the enemy reaction. In Villers-Bocage behind them, additional British squadrons took up blocking positions, while the divisional headquarters began preparing to exploit whatever opportunity the ridge offered. For those on the move toward Point 213, the sense of urgency mixed with growing confidence. The lead vehicles crested the ridge, engines idling as the crews surveyed the terrain. To the British, it felt like the plan was working. They had arrived unopposed. They had secured the high ground. They had outpaced the German ability to respond. For a brief moment, the desert rats owned the initiative. But beneath that fleeting optimism lay a fatal assumption that the German armored reserve was still repositioning, or still assembling, or still too far away to pose an immediate threat. What the British could not know was that, in a stroke of timing neither side had planned, one of Germany's most formidable armored units had reached the Villers-Bocage area the night before. Hidden among the hedgerows and sunken lanes only a short distance away were several Tiger I heavy tanks, machines vastly superior in armor and firepower to anything in the British column. One of those tanks belonged to Michael Wittmann, a veteran tank commander with a reputation for audacity and precision. He, along with other elements of the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, had taken up positions dangerously close to the British route of advance. Their arrival had been rushed, exhausting, and chaotic, but it meant that at the very moment British forces believed they had seized the advantage, they were in fact moving directly into the jaws of a lethal counterstrike. As the British settled into their positions on point 213, unaware of what lurked beyond the tree line, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic armored clashes of the entire Normandy campaign. The sense of calm would not last. The next move belonged to the Germans. In the hours before the British advance reached Villers-Bocage, another drama was unfolding along the narrow country roads south of Caen. It involved engines that rumbled like thunder, tracks that carved grooves into the French earth, and crews who had fought their way across continents. The arrival of the German heavy armor was not part of any grand plan. It was a frantic reaction to the widening breach forming between the American and British sectors. Yet the timing would prove decisive. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion had been ordered toward Normandy with urgency. These were not frontline troops accustomed to constant movement. They were a specialized force created to anchor German defenses wherever the Allies attempted a breakthrough. Their core strength lay in the Tiger I, a tank whose silhouette alone could alter the course of a battlefield. In early June 1944, this battalion had been scattered by air attacks, slowed by mechanical troubles, and strained by the demands of rushing heavy armor across a landscape congested with retreating units and ruined infrastructure. By the time they reached the area west of Caen, they had been battered by circumstances long before seeing a single Allied tank. Even with these challenges, the Tigers represented a concentration of power unmatched by anything the British 7th Armoured Division possessed. Each machine weighed close to 57 tons, carried thick slabs of interlocking armor, and mounted an 88mm KWK 36 LAN-56 gun, the most feared tank weapon in Europe. This cannon had earned its reputation in North Africa, where it turned Allied armor into smoldering wrecks before opposing crews could even identify the source of the attack. Its range, accuracy, and destructive force set it apart from the British 75mm guns and even the more formidable 17-pounder. The terrain around Villers-Bocage created an ideal hunting environment for these monsters. The Bocage country provided sunken lanes, hedgerows as thick as fortress walls, and pockets of woodland perfect for concealing large vehicles. For a Tiger crew, these features offered the opportunity to position their tank in places where its enormous bulk would remain unseen until the instant it chose to strike. Among the commanders guiding these heavy machines was Michael Wittmann, already well known within German armored forces. His experience stretched back to the early phases of the war, beginning first in reconnaissance, then shifting to armored vehicles as his talent for quick assessment and decisive action became obvious to superiors. By 1944, he had accumulated a deadly tally of destroyed Soviet armor on the Eastern Front, where he demonstrated a blend of aggression and discipline rarely seen in tank warfare. His crew trusted him implicitly. Their Tiger was an extension of his instincts. When the 101st SS Battalion reached the sector near Villers-Bocage on 12th of June, the men were exhausted. Yet they understood the gravity of their situation. German command recognized that the British were attempting something bold. If the enemy armored forces reached the ridge east of Villers-Bocage and pushed behind the German flank, the entire defensive network around Caen would be compromised. The newly arrived Tigers were sent forward as the only available force capable of contesting the British thrust. The battalion's commander, SS Sturmbannführer Heinz von Westenhagen, directed his companies to disperse into defensive positions west of Caen. The first company moved toward the area near the Château d'Orbois. The second company, under Wittmann's immediate influence, established itself near the high ground overlooking the road to Villers-Bocage. There, in the early hours, crews checked ammunition racks, fuel levels, and optics. Mechanics crawled across engine decks, tightening bolts, adjusting track tension, and listening for the subtle clinks and hisses that indicated trouble beneath the armor plating. The mood among the Tiger crews was tense, yet focused. They had been sent into Normandy as specialists, problem solvers deployed wherever the Allied armor threatened to break the line. Rumors circulated among the men. British tanks advancing rapidly, armored columns passing through lightly held positions, reconnaissance units reporting unusual movement south of the main front. With limited intelligence, the commanders relied heavily on field reports and instinct. One fact became clear. British armor was pushing toward Villers-Bocage, and its forward elements might already be within striking distance. On the morning of 13th June, Wittmann surveyed the landscape around the ridge near point 213. From his concealed position, the view toward Villers-Bocage was partially obscured by hedgerows and small copses of trees. Yet there was enough of an opening to see movement along the road, not scattered patrols. A column. A long one. Tanks, carriers, and trucks. British vehicles stretching well beyond the bends of the lane. For a moment, the sheer scale of the approaching force surprised even him. The British had pushed deep into a sector where few expected a sudden armored breakthrough. For Wittmann, hesitation held no value. The longer he watched the British advance, the clearer the situation became. If the enemy established themselves on the ridge in force, German counterattacks would turn into costly frontal assaults. The only effective way to restore control of the area was to strike immediately, before the British realized how vulnerable their position truly was. His Tiger sat poised within a narrow sunken lane, its hull shielded by high earth banks and dense foliage. The other Tigers nearby remained hidden, waiting for instructions. Wittmann's mind was already racing through possibilities. He had no time to coordinate a lengthy plan. The British column was too close. Every second increased the risk that they would spread out, deploy infantry, or prepare defensive positions. He understood that decisive action carried its own risks, but inaction presented far greater ones. Inside the Tiger, the crew settled into readiness. Loader, gunner, radio operator, driver, each moved with practiced rhythm, speaking in quiet, deliberate tones. The gunner checked the telescopic sight, adjusting for clarity. The loader positioned high explosive and armor-piercing rounds within easy reach. The driver eased his hands along the controls, knowing the first burst of movement would determine whether the ambush succeeded. They had fought together before. Trust within the crew sharpened each motion. The environment around them hummed with distant engines and the intermittent clatter of British tracks rolling over stone. The British were unaware of the trap forming only a short distance away. The sound of their movement drifted through the hedgerows like a steady announcement of opportunity. For Wittmann, the moment demanded action. He gave the signal. The Tiger's engine growled to life, sending a vibration through the lane like an awakening beast. The vehicle pushed forward, its tracks grinding against the packed earth. As it cleared the foliage, sunlight glinted off its armor, revealing the unmistakable outline that Allied crews feared above all others. This was no patrol vehicle creeping along a hedge. It was a machine engineered for dominance. The ambush had begun. Wittmann's Tiger rolled directly toward the British column, positioning itself for a strike that would reverberate across the entire Normandy front. The 88mm gun elevated slightly, then angled toward its first target. The German crew acted with a single, unified purpose. They understood the stakes. They understood the vulnerability of the enemy. They understood the advantage of surprise. The roar of their opening shot would signal the end of British momentum and the beginning of a battle that would enter military history as one of the most shocking armored clashes of the war. The British advance into Villers-Bocage had unfolded swiftly, almost too smoothly for a battlefield defined by hedgerows ambushes, and concealed weapon pits. After establishing themselves inside the town and pushing a vanguard toward Point 213, British commanders believed the moment was ripe for the decisive maneuver that Operation Perch had been designed to achieve. The plan relied on speed: seize Villers-Bocage, secure the ridge beyond it, and then unleash armored columns deep behind the German flank. The early hours of June 13th seemed to validate the boldness of the concept. In the British command vehicles positioned west of the town, maps were unrolled across engine bonnets. The layout of the local roads, the contours of the ridge east of Villers-Bocage, and the potential avenues toward Caen dominated the discussion. Brigadier William Looney Hind, a man accustomed to rapid maneuver from years of desert warfare, concluded that the situation demanded forward momentum. His instincts favored pressing the advantage before German heavy reinforcements materialized. Experience had taught him how essential initiative was in mobile operations. In North Africa, the Desert Rats had survived by exploiting openings before the enemy reorganized. He sensed something similar here. Normandy was far greener, more claustrophobic, and less forgiving than the Sahara. Yet the principle remained: hesitate for too long, and the window closes. At this stage of the operation, morale among the forward elements of the 4th County of London Yeomanry was high. Their Cromwell tanks had pushed through the countryside without encountering armored resistance, and the ease with which they occupied Villers-Bocage suggested that the German line was far more brittle than intelligence officers had predicted. Crews who had fought through the difficult terrain in the previous days felt a rare surge of optimism. Infantry from the rifle brigade accompanying the tanks sensed a shift in momentum. Many believed the day ahead could be decisive. As the column extended eastward from the town and climbed the slope toward Point 213, the terrain changed character. The high ground offered a commanding view over the undulating fields. British crews looked across the rise with a sense of accomplishment, believing they had outpaced any German counterforce. They dismounted to check their surroundings, assess nearby hedgerows, and wait for further direction. Engines idled as tank commanders peered through binoculars. The road behind them curved gently back toward Villers-Bocage, a visual reminder of the spearhead stretching deep into contested territory. What they could not see, and what British intelligence had overlooked, was the movement of German armored units converging on the area. Reports filtering back to the 7th Armored Division headquarters mentioned enemy infantry scattered in woods, occasional anti-tank guns, and reconnaissance vehicles. Yet nothing suggested the arrival of heavy armor. Communications across the wider front were strained. Terrain, enemy interference, and gaps created by the dispersed advance limited the clarity of information reaching each headquarters. The absence of expected German resistance bred confidence. Inside Villers-Bocage, British forces secured defensive points in case German counterattacks developed along the flanks. Bren carriers were parked at key intersections, machine gun teams took positions behind stone walls, and artillery observers climbed into upper floors of buildings to find fields of fire. Each of these steps reflected training and discipline, but also a belief that any response from the Germans would be measured, methodical, and limited. The apparent emptiness of the countryside, however, was deceptive. Thick hedgerows shielded numerous approach routes. Narrow lanes could conceal tanks far larger than anything the British possessed. The silence of the morning masked much more than it revealed. What the British interpreted as unoccupied ground was, in truth, a landscape where German units were repositioning and preparing to strike. Operation Perch hinged on maintaining momentum. If the British consolidated too slowly, the opportunity to force a German withdrawal would evaporate. That urgency explains why the forward elements at Point 213 paused without entrenching or spreading out. They expected orders to advance further east and deepen their penetration behind the German flank. Instead, they found themselves waiting for instructions, waiting for additional armor to move up, waiting for confirmation that German forces were indeed collapsing back toward Caen. During this lull, radio traffic surged across the British network. Requests for fuel, ammunition, and infantry support were exchanged. Reports from Villers-Bocage described light firefights against German skirmishers probing the town's outskirts. Nothing in these transmissions suggested an imminent armored confrontation. Crews continued to scan the tree lines, but the sense of threat had diminished. The ridge felt secure. So did the road. The enemy seemed distant. Meanwhile, in the hedgerows north of the road, Wittmann's Tiger Company monitored the British movement. Their vantage point offered a partial but revealing glimpse of the column parked along the roadside. The Tigers had arrived only hours earlier, their crews still recovering from the exhausting march toward Normandy. Yet they recognized the significance of the situation. A British armoured spearhead on that ridge posed a direct danger to the German defensive structure holding Caen. This was the moment the heavy armour had been sent to prevent. Operation Perch illustrates how swiftly the fortunes of an advancing force can shift. The British had executed an aggressive, well-planned flanking manoeuvre. But without detailed knowledge of German heavy armour movements, the gamble rested on incomplete information. Their assumption that they had reached the ridge before enemy armour gave them confidence, yet it also encouraged them to linger on exposed ground. While the Cromwells and carriers remained stationary, German tank crews finalized their preparations. Engines were warmed, shells were positioned for quick loading, optics were cleaned and checked. Tigers do not move lightly. Their presence is felt through vibration and sound. Yet in the enclosed lanes and wooded orchards north of Point 213, their preparations remained unheard. The British were operating according to the tempo of their own plan, unaware that another tempo had already begun beating against theirs. Wittmann had watched the British column lengthen along the road. He saw the spacing between vehicles, the orientation of the lead tanks, and the lack of infantry deployed across the flanks. These details revealed a force that felt secure. A relaxed formation is quicker to overwhelm than one tense and expecting crisis. For Operation Perch to succeed, the British needed to maintain the thrust toward Caen, apply pressure, and compel the Germans into retreat. Instead, the advance paused at a moment when it could least afford to. Every minute that passed allowed German armour to settle into positions of lethal opportunity. As the morning progressed, the British presence on the ridge became more visible from the German vantage points. Silhouettes of tank turrets caught in openings between trees, glints of metal as sunlight reflected from barrels and periscopes, and the unmistakable movement of infantry stepping between carriers offered clear evidence of a target-rich environment. Wittmann's observations led to a single stark conclusion. The British had overextended themselves. The spearhead had gone further than its support elements. The flanks were thin, reconnaissance had not penetrated the surrounding countryside deeply enough, and the armoured column was parked on ground that offered little protection against an assault from concealed positions. This was the moment where Operation Perch's greatest weakness revealed itself. The British had achieved speed without securing situational dominance. The gamble relied on the assumption that the enemy was disorganized. The reality, hiding only a short distance away, was far more dangerous. The stage was fully set. The British held the ridge, the Germans held the shadows. The fate of the operation hung in the space between them. In the next chapter, the deception of Caen would break apart. The British spearhead, poised for a deeper thrust, would find itself subjected to one of the most sudden and violent armoured assaults of the campaign. The Tigers were ready. Their commander had chosen the moment. The strike was about to unfold with devastating clarity. The ridge at Point 213 had grown strangely quiet. Engines idled in place, tank crews leaned from hatches to stretch their backs, and infantrymen scanned the hedgerows with a mixture of curiosity and vigilance. The British spearhead believed itself ahead of the German reaction, perched on ground intended to serve as a launch point for the next phase of the operation. Yet beneath that stillness, a tension hung in the air, subtle, unseen, and gathering strength like a storm behind a bank of clouds. Inside one of the sunken lanes north of the ridge, the Tiger commanded by Michael Wittmann began to rumble forward. The movement was deliberate. He eased the heavy machine ahead through the narrow passage, its turret angled slightly toward the road. Behind him, several other Tigers remained in position, engines growling softly as their crews prepared to provide covering fire. The decision had been made. The German attack would begin at once. The Tiger emerged from cover with a presence that demanded attention. At first, the British crews at the rear of the column saw only motion in the hedgerow. Then the massive tank burst into view, its thick armor plates catching the morning light. A commander shouted a warning, but the distance was too short for meaningful reaction. Within moments, the silhouette of the German heavy tank stood fully revealed, blocking the narrow lane like a steel wall. Whitman swung the 88mm gun toward the closest British tank. The Cromwell was stationary, its turret turned away. Before the crew inside could comprehend the threat, a flash erupted from the Tiger's muzzle. The shot struck with devastating force, tearing into the British vehicle and engulfing it in flame. The explosion echoed across the ridge, snapping the stillness like a whip crack. In that moment, the British column realized it was under direct assault. Panic rippled along the line of vehicles. Crews scrambled inside their turrets. Commanders shouted for their drivers to reverse or maneuver into firing positions. Yet space along that narrow ridge was scarce. Tanks that attempted to turn became entangled with carriers and trucks parked too tightly together. Infantrymen dove for cover as the German tank advanced. Wittmann adjusted course and drove directly into the British column. The Tiger's wide tracks crushed the edge of the bank, dislodging soil and debris onto the road. Its engine roared as it advanced deeper into the mass of British vehicles. At such close range, each shot from the German gun brought catastrophic results. Carriers were torn open, half-tracks overturned. An armored car attempted to accelerate past the Tiger, only to be blown apart mid-turn. The British Firefly, parked nearer the front of the formation, attempted to bring its powerful 17-pounder to bear. Its gunner swung the barrel toward the Tiger, but the angle offered no clear shot. Whitman saw the Firefly's movement and sent a round through its hull before it could reposition. The impact silenced the only British tank on the ridge capable of engaging a Tiger from head-on. The Tiger pressed forward, firing repeatedly. Each discharge lit the interior of the turret with a fierce glow. Inside, Wittmann's crew worked with machine-like precision. The loader fed shell after shell into the breach. The gunner made rapid adjustments, shifting focus between armored and soft-skinned vehicles. Smoke began to drift across the ridge as burning fuel tanks ignited. Shouts of wounded soldiers mixed with the clatter of debris struck by secondary explosions. A British anti-tank team attempted to deploy a 6-pounder gun near the roadside. They unhitched the weapon, swung it into position, and readied the first shell. The Tiger's machine gun swept the area with a burst of fire, forcing the crew to scatter before the main gun completed the task. The anti-tank weapon was hit with such force that it folded against the hedgerow like bent wire. By now, the British formation had dissolved into chaos. The ridge became a battlefield of burning armor, overturned trucks, and men seeking any cover they could find behind roadside banks. Engineers crouched behind their carriers, clutching rifles unsuited for the enemy bearing down on them. Medics rushed toward the wounded, dragging soldiers away from burning wrecks. The air grew thick with dust and acrid smoke. Through the haze, the Tiger continued its relentless push. The machine felt almost alive as it churned through the wreckage, its tracks grinding over metal fragments and shattered glass. Whitman maneuvered along the length of the British column, firing at targets as they appeared through the shifting smoke. A Cromwell attempted to ram the Tiger from behind, hoping to jam its tracks. The German crew heard the impact, but felt only a jolt. The Tiger responded with an immediate shot that ended the attempt. Infantry from the Rifle Brigade attempted to flank the German tank using the hedgerows. They carried PIAT launchers, their only weapon capable of piercing thick armor at close range. The hedges offered concealment, but the Tiger's supporting vehicles in the tree line opened fire first. Machine gun bursts stitched across the brush, scattering the infantry before they could close the distance. The British attempt to envelop the Tiger collapsed before it could take shape. As the minutes passed, the destruction spread across the ridge in a widening arc. Vehicles once neatly aligned had been transformed into broken silhouettes, marked by black smoke and flame. Where the British had paused to prepare for further movement, there was now a graveyard of steel. The Tiger's sudden appearance had turned their resting point into a killing ground. Yet even within this devastation, isolated acts of resistance continued. A pair of British crewmen stripped a mounted Browning machine gun from a carrier and attempted to lay down suppressive fire while others evacuated the wounded. Another Cromwell crew managed to pull their tank partially behind a hedgerow and fire around at the Tiger's side. The shot struck harmlessly against its armor, revealing the futility of their effort. Wittmann rotated his turret, returned fire, and silenced the hidden tank with a direct hit. The German tank, having effectively shattered the British spearhead, began to slow. Wittmann surveyed the wreckage through his optics. Flames marked the spots where vehicles had once stood neatly along the roadside. Smoke curled upward toward the sky. The ridge lay still again, yet this stillness felt nothing like the calm earlier that morning. This was the silence that follows destruction. The other tigers in the company prepared to advance as well. They had remained in the shadows during Wittmann's charge, awaiting the moment when their support would be required. Now, with the British formation in ruins, they shifted forward to secure the area. German infantry moved cautiously through the smoke, checking for survivors and clearing the road. Wittmann communicated with his men. The initial assault had succeeded beyond expectation. The British spearhead had been broken at the precise moment it believed itself secure. The path toward Villers-Bocage lay open, yet the battle was far from over. The destruction on point 213 marked only the first phase of the German counterstrike. The burning ridge signaled the beginning of a larger confrontation that would soon spill into the streets of Villers-Bocage itself, where the British still held positions and attempted to regroup. The Tiger's roar had shattered the advance, but the fight for the town would demand a new kind of combat, fought at closer ranges and under harsher conditions. The smoke drifting from point 213 had barely begun to settle when the rumble of engines grew louder inside Villers-Bocage. British troops stationed within the town had heard the explosions, though none yet understood the scale of the destruction unfolding on the ridge. The sounds echoed through the narrow streets, deep concussions, crackling flames, and the unmistakable thud of high-velocity rounds striking armor. Soldiers paused at doorways, commanders leaned from hatches, and gunners scanned the approaches toward the ridge. Something had gone terribly wrong, and the shape of that disaster was about to come roaring down the road. Wittmann's Tiger appeared on the western edge of the town with a suddenness that bordered on the unreal. A single armored giant emerged from between hedgerows, its tracks carving deep cuts into the soil, its turret facing forward like the gaze of a predator searching for its next strike. The Tiger had just mauled a column of British armor, yet it surged ahead as if propelled by momentum and certainty. In Wittmann's view, the destruction on the ridge was only the beginning. The enemy's foothold in the town had to be broken before reinforcements could organize. British reconnaissance vehicles near the town entrance were the first to see the approaching danger. A troop of light M3 Stuart tanks had been parked along the street, their crews preparing to redeploy. One commander spotted movement at the edge of the hedgerow and froze. The shape that materialized was unmistakable. A tiger entering a town was a terrifying sight, far larger than any Cromwell, with armor thick enough to shrug off nearly all Allied weapons at standard ranges. A Stuart turret swung toward the threat, but the action came too late. The Tiger's 88mm gun sent its first shell screaming down the street. It struck with brutal precision. The Stuart erupted in a burst of flame and metal, the shockwave rippling across the buildings. Tiles fell from rooftops, civilians ducked for cover, and British infantry scattered behind stone walls. The remaining Stuarts attempted to maneuver, their drivers trying to reverse through the confined space. Wittmann fired again. A second Stuart crumpled under the impact. The third met the same fate moments later. Inside the town, the chaos grew. The narrow roads amplified every explosion, sending noise crashing through the alleyways. Civilians who had cautiously ventured outside earlier now scrambled back into cellars or fled through side streets. The British troops who had felt secure only minutes earlier were suddenly in the middle of an armored storm. British headquarters vehicles parked near the center of Villers-Bocage also came under threat. Officers hurried to reorganize their defenses, shouting for tanks to reposition, while runners dashed between buildings to relay orders. A Cromwell, serving as an artillery observation post, attempted to block the Tiger's advance by moving across the street. Its hull-mounted gun fired a round that struck the German tank's front plate and bounced away harmlessly. The Tiger's return shot smashed into the Cromwell, sending a fireball into the air and hurling debris across the street. Wittmann continued driving deeper into Villers-Bocage, pushing through the narrow, winding roads with a determination that shocked those who witnessed it. The tiger's bulk seemed almost too large for the space it occupied. Its tracks tore through garden walls and stone borders, while its turret rotated with steady predatory precision. Shop fronts shattered as the tank pushed past. Carriers that attempted to maneuver were cut down by machine gun bursts from the tiger's coaxial weapon. Every corner presented a new threat. British infantry teams crouched behind carts and rubble, waiting for an opening to fire their PIAT launchers. Sometimes they launched their projectiles too early, and the grenades sailed wide or struck glancing angles on the tiger's hardened armor. Sometimes they fired too late, and the tiger's passage silenced them before they could reload. Still, the British fought fiercely. The close quarters of the town offered concealment that the open ridge never could, giving brave soldiers small chances to strike back. Inside the tiger, the atmosphere was tense and focused. The crew worked with a rhythm forged in countless battles. The loader handled ammunition with swift, efficient movement. The gunner tracked targets through fleeting gaps in the buildings. The driver navigated terrain more suited for bicycles and carts than a heavy tank. Each action relied on instinct and cohesion. The noise inside the turret was deafening: engine growl, clattering metal, and the occasional muffled thump of bricks sliding across the hull, but the crew concentrated on the work before them. As the tiger advanced toward the town square, resistance intensified. British infantry deployed mortars in courtyards and fired through shattered windows. A Sherman Firefly, hidden beyond a row of houses, maneuvered to gain a line of fire. The Firefly's 17-pounder could threaten even a tiger if aimed at vulnerable angles. Its commander edged forward, searching for a gap in the buildings that offered a clear shot at Wittmann's tank. At the same moment, a British anti-tank crew managed to haul their 6-pounder gun into an intersection. They had waited for the tiger to pass a cluster of burning vehicles, judging the angle and distance carefully. When Wittmann's tank rolled into view, the British crew acted instantly. A round slammed into the tiger's suspension, sending a jarring shudder through the vehicle. The impact froze the tiger in the middle of the street. More British teams fired from upper floors and alleyways, hoping to immobilize the machine further. Wittmann's crew returned fire, the tiger's main gun blasting apart a nearby wall and sending British infantry diving for cover. The duel continued for several heart-pounding moments as the crew inside the German tank assessed the damage. The tiger remained capable of firing, but movement had become erratic. The hit had damaged components essential for maneuvering through the tight roads. Smoke seeped through the alleyways, buildings burned from earlier explosions, debris blocked escape routes. Surrounded by resistance and unable to advance reliably, Wittmann made a critical decision. Continuing the fight inside the immobilized tank risked total loss. The only choice was to abandon the vehicle and escape on foot. He ordered the crew to dismount. They exited quickly, slipping through side streets and moving toward the outskirts of the town. They had completed a devastating attack, yet the fight for Villers-Bocage was far from finished. As Wittmann's crew evacuated, additional German units converged on the town. Panzer IVs and supporting infantry moved in from the northern approaches. Fresh mechanized forces joined the fight, determined to dislodge the British completely. The battle now shifted from a single tiger's charge to a broader engagement across multiple streets and sectors. British forces inside the town continued their resistance. Tanks from B Squadron of the 4th County of London Yeomanry maneuvered to counter the German armor, exchanging fire at dangerously close ranges. Firefly crews hunted for opportunities to strike at the German tanks' weaker flanks. Infantry teams counterattacked through alleys, engaging panzer grenadiers in brutal room-to-room fighting. The intensity of the clash tore Villers-Bocage apart. Houses collapsed from repeated hits, gardens burned, and the once quiet streets filled with shattered vehicles representing both sides. What had begun as an ambush on the ridge had evolved into a sprawling urban battle. Hour after hour, the contest continued. The British, though courageous, found themselves increasingly outnumbered and fragmented. Communications between companies became strained as German armor pushed deeper into the town. Commanders on the British side recognized the mounting pressure. As afternoon approached, the decision became unavoidable. The town could no longer be held. Orders went out to withdraw toward the west, regroup, and form a defensive perimeter outside Villers-Bocage. The withdrawal marked the end of the street battle, but not the end of the day's struggle. A larger confrontation awaited outside the town, where the desert rats would make their final stand. The British withdrawal from the shattered streets of Villers-Bocage unfolded under the cover of smoke and confusion. Engines roared as surviving tanks reversed through debris-littered lanes, while infantry hurried to regroup outside the town's western edge. The battle within the walls had grown too chaotic to sustain, a swirl of collapsing masonry, German armor pushing down main roads, and British forces divided into isolated pockets. Commanders made a swift calculation. To preserve any chance of future action, the remaining units of the 22nd Armored Brigade needed to escape the town and establish a defensible perimeter on the higher ground beyond. Beyond Villers-Bocage lay a patchwork of ridges, orchards, and farm boundaries. This area would soon become known among the troops as the Brigade Box. It was a rough but defensible position where the British intended to withstand whatever counterattacks the Germans prepared. The region's natural contours created a basin bordered by hedgerows, with several slight rises that offered fields of fire across the approaches. In military terms, it was not ideal, but it was the only ground the British could reach quickly while still retaining cohesion. As the surviving tanks and carriers emerged from the western outskirts, the exhausted crews took stock of their situation. They had entered Villers-Bocage filled with confidence and ambition earlier that morning. Now they were fighting to stabilize a shrinking front. Even so, their resolve remained intact. The desert rats had endured worse conditions in the North African desert, and soldiers who had fought at Sidi Rezegh, Ghazala, and El Alamein understood the value of a resilient defensive position. The retreating units wasted no time reinforcing their new line. Cromwell tanks were positioned hull down behind hedges, their turrets angled to cover the approaches from the town. Sherman Fireflies found vantage points along narrow lanes, their long 17-pounder barrels extending just past the foliage. Infantry from the Rifle Brigade formed a ring of foxholes and rifle pits, supported by machine gun teams who hauled their Vickers guns into place and began digging in. Sappers laid out mines and prepared fallback paths through the patchwork of fields. Every man understood that a German counterattack was imminent. The sound of engines from inside Villers-Bocage grew louder, blending with the crackling of burning buildings and the occasional distant explosion. German forces were reorganizing. New units were arriving. The pressure that had driven the British from the town was gathering strength for a new assault. British officers walked the line, speaking to crewmen perched in turrets, checking ammunition stores, and coordinating fire sectors. Radio operators established communication networks among the scattered squads and vehicle crews. The brigade had lost a significant portion of its armored strength that morning, yet the officers maintained calm control. Their experience in fast-moving engagements gave them confidence that a well-prepared defensive stand could blunt even the formidable German armor now advancing. Shortly before midday, the first German elements emerged from Villers-Bocage. Panzer Grenadiers pressed forward cautiously, supported by Panzer IVs and a number of surviving Tigers from the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion. The push toward the British perimeter began with probing movements, small groups testing the strength of the defenses. The Germans encountered rifle fire almost immediately. British sharpshooters targeted infantry advancing along hedged pathways, forcing them to retreat temporarily. Moments later, the first major German armored thrust surged toward the brigade box. Panzer IVs rolled across open farmland, their turrets rotating as they fired toward British hull-down positions. The British tanks responded in unison. Cromwell sent rounds toward advancing armor, their shots aimed at the thinner side plates of the German tanks whenever they turned. Fireflies, using their superior penetration capability, sought out high-value targets. When their guns spoke, the sharp crack of the 17-pounder echoed across the fields like a rifle shot amplified to monstrous scale. One German tank attempted to advance along a narrow farm track, hoping to flank the British positions. A concealed British anti-tank team spotted its movement. The team swung their 6-pounder gun into position, aimed along the gap between two trees, and opened fire. The round tore into the Panzer's hull, forcing it to halt in a plume of smoke. German infantry sought cover behind the immobilized vehicle while the British crew loaded another shell. Seconds later, a second impact ended the threat. The fight intensified. Artillery observers from the British side climbed onto the upper branches of orchard trees or perched inside damaged farmhouses to gain clear views of the enemy's approach paths. To the west, American observers from the 1st Infantry Division coordinated long-range artillery strikes to support their British allies. Before the Germans reached the British perimeter, shells from distant batteries rained down upon their staging areas, disrupting infantry formations and scattering vehicles. The ground shook beneath the British line as explosions erupted in the distance, creating a curtain of dirt and smoke that slowed the German advance. Despite these difficulties, the German commanders were determined to crush the British foothold. They launched a second and more concentrated assault. Several Tigers advanced in a wedge formation, their frontal armor facing the British tanks positioned behind the hedgerows. These heavy tanks advanced steadily, absorbing small arms fire and shrugging off glancing hits. Their 88mm guns fired at known British positions. In response, the defenders relied on concealment and discipline. Firefly crews waited patiently for side or rear shots, knowing their chances improved only when German tanks maneuvered at angles. One such opportunity arose when a Tiger attempted to reposition to engage a Cromwell that had fired from behind a stone wall. As the Tiger pivoted, its flank appeared briefly between two breaks in the hedgerow. A British Firefly commander spotted the gap, shouted a command, and fired a single round. The shot struck behind the Tiger's turret ring. Flames erupted from the vehicle's rear compartment. The German machine jolted to a halt, enveloped in a column of black smoke. The destruction of a Tiger boosted the British defenders' morale. Encouraged by the kill, the line steadied itself. Infantry tightened their positions. Tank commanders identified new angles of fire. The fight turned into a grueling contest of attrition. German troops assaulted repeatedly, but each drive met fierce resistance. Machine gun teams tore into advancing infantry. Mortar crews hurled shells along tree lines. British tanks shifted positions constantly to avoid becoming predictable targets. Afternoon shadows grew long across the fields as the battle wore on. The Germans attempted one final major assault, combining armor and grenadiers in a coordinated push. This attack reached the outer hedgerows of the brigade box, where hand-to-hand fighting broke out. British riflemen held their ground fiercely. A group of sappers armed with explosives disabled a Panzer IV that had broken through an opening. Every inch of ground became contested. Eventually, the German effort faltered. The repeated failures drained their momentum. Losses in men and machines mounted. The afternoon sky dimmed beneath lingering smoke and late-day haze. By evening, the counterattacks diminished. German forces pulled back to reorganize. The British defenders remained in place, bloodied, tired, but unbroken. Yet as the sun set over the battlefield, British command assessed the wider operational picture. The original objective of Operation Perch, the bold flanking movement toward Caen, had stalled. Holding the brigade box indefinitely risked encirclement and unnecessary casualties. The fighting had proven that their forward position was no longer sustainable. That night, under the cover of darkness, the order came to withdraw. Quietly, methodically, the British packed their positions. Engines were started only when necessary. Voices were kept low. Tank tracks were muffled with blankets when possible. Wounded were evacuated first. Then the surviving vehicles rolled back toward secure lines, leaving defensive positions they had fought so hard to hold. By dawn, the Germans advanced once more, only to find the brigade box empty. The day-long battle had exhausted both sides, but the British had denied the Germans the dramatic rout they sought. The stand outside Villers-Bocage became a testament to the resilience of the desert rats, an echo of their defiance in earlier campaigns. Yet the story of Villers-Bocage did not end on that ridge. The aftermath would stretch far beyond the battlefield, traveling through propaganda channels, military reports, and the memories of those who survived. When the first light of dawn crept across the fields west of Villers-Bocage, the battlefield lay silent in a way that only follows a day of extraordinary violence. Smoke drifted from gutted vehicles, craters pocked the soft Normandy soil. Along the lanes, burnt-out Cromwells and shattered carriers marked the route of the British withdrawal. The Germans advanced cautiously, expecting renewed resistance. Instead, they found an empty defensive ring and the brittle remains of a hard-fought stand. The immediate tactical outcome appeared, on the surface, to favor the German forces. They held Villers-Bocage. They held the ridge. They had forced the British 22nd Armoured Brigade to withdraw after a day of savage combat. However, the results in the wider context of the Normandy campaign were far more nuanced. What unfolded in the hours and days that followed was a mixture of confusion, pride, strategic recalibration, and, most powerfully, myth-making. British commanders spent the night analysing the rapid rise and fall of Operation Perch's most daring manoeuvre. They reviewed the reports from tank crews who had escaped the inferno on point 213, listened to shaken infantry describe the sudden assault, and sifted through the accounts of officers who had fought through the streets of Villers-Bocage. Each testimony carried the same message. Heavy German armour had arrived with breathtaking speed, and its impact had been overwhelming. Within British headquarters, quiet frustration settled over the senior staff. The Desert Rats were among the most celebrated divisions in the British Army. Many had fought in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. They possessed a reputation for courage and operational flexibility. Yet here, in the patchwork fields of Normandy, a single German heavy tank had shattered the momentum of a larger armoured formation. The unexpected violence of the ambush forced a hard re-examination of doctrine, reconnaissance practices, and assumptions made during the initial days of the campaign. There were disagreements as well. Some officers argued that the advance had been too aggressive without sufficient infantry support. Others insisted that the plan was sound but had encountered unlucky timing. The 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion had arrived at the exact moment the British spearhead pushed forward. A few believed that better intelligence could have prevented the disaster. Yet many who had stood on the ridge or fought in the town understood that even perfect information might not have changed the outcome. The Tiger's presence had altered every equation. As these debates unfolded, the mood among the soldiers remained resilient. Survivors spoke of the chaos on the ridge, the roar of the 88mm gun, and the ferocity of the battle inside the town. Yet they also remembered how they had held the brigade box against repeated attacks, how artillery support had torn into German lines, and how tank crews had fought from hull-down positions until nightfall. Their pride lay in the stand they made, not in the ground they relinquished. The withdrawal had been tactical, controlled, and necessary. The British force had not broken. It had redeployed. On the German side, the response took a markedly different tone. News of the ambush raced through the ranks. Crews who had fought under Wittmann's direction described the astonishing scene on the ridge. Burning British tanks lining the road, carriers overturned, and the speed with which the ambush had collapsed the enemy column. Officers who arrived later walked the length of the battlefield in stunned silence, examining the wrecks as though witnessing the aftermath of a natural disaster. Even hardened veterans recognized the scale of what had occurred. Within hours, German propaganda agencies seized the moment. The war was going poorly elsewhere. Allied troops were pushing inland along several fronts, and German units across France were forced into chaotic defensive maneuvers. The events at Villers-Bocage offered a rare and powerful narrative, one that could bolster morale and feed the myth of German armoured superiority. Radio broadcasts reported that a single Tiger tank had decimated a British armoured brigade. Newspapers portrayed Wittmann as a heroic figure whose actions had altered the course of the battle. The story spread beyond the front. In Berlin, senior figures within the Nazi propaganda apparatus recognized the usefulness of highlighting an armored triumph during a time when news from the Eastern Front and Italy painted far gloomier pictures. Michael Wittmann's name became synonymous with the idea of the unstoppable German tank ace, the warrior who could turn the tide with courage and skill. Photographs circulated of him shaking hands with Adolf Hitler. Medals were awarded, speeches praised the abilities of the Tiger crews. Yet amid the praise, the battle's reality remained far more complex. The destruction on point 213 owed much to surprise. The British column had been halted, stationary and vulnerable. Infantry support had not been dispersed along the hedgerows. Reconnaissance assets had not detected the Tiger Company concealed in the woods. Whitman's skill was undeniable, but circumstances had created an almost ideal environment for a heavy tank to strike with maximum effect. What followed in the town and during the later German counterattacks revealed a different story, one where British forces inflicted significant losses, blunted further advances, and eventually withdrew only to regroup and continue the campaign. Over time, the weight of propaganda overshadowed these details. German public perception solidified around the myth of a lone tiger overturning British plans. The actual German losses, multiple tanks destroyed, infantry units worn down, and the broader failure to exploit their momentary advantage across the wider Caen front were rarely mentioned. Within the British Army, the battle triggered introspection rather than myths. Officers studied the ambush to refine future operations. Tank crews discussed firing discipline, spacing in columns, and how to remain alert in seemingly safe positions. Engineers improved communication equipment. Artillery observers pushed for greater integration with armored movements. The psychological impact on Allied troops cannot be overstated. Reports of Tiger tanks prowling the Bocage spread rapidly through the ranks. Soldiers speaking in mess tents, trenches, and aid stations described the German heavy tank with a mixture of caution and exaggerated fear. Some units began to misidentify any long-barreled German tank as a Tiger, fueling what historians later termed Tiger panic, a phenomenon born of whispered stories and battlefield rumor. Yet the factual record demonstrates that British and American crews adapted quickly. Fireflies were used more aggressively. Anti-tank teams modified their tactics to prioritize flanking opportunities. Pilots from close air support squadrons were given clearer directives to target heavy armor. Within weeks, several Tiger tanks fell victim to these revised strategies. Still, Villers-Bocage left a lasting imprint. The battle represented a meeting of two different philosophies of armored warfare: the British reliance on maneuver and the German focus on heavy striking power. The encounter revealed the strengths and weaknesses of each approach. More importantly, it demonstrated how swiftly momentum could shift when one side achieved the element of surprise. The story of Villers-Bocage grew in retelling. Veterans spoke of the eerie silence before the first shot, the weight of the shockwave as the Tiger fired, the frantic moments in the streets, and the grim determination during the stand outside the town. Interviews conducted years later carried the same mixture of respect, disbelief, and somber reflection. The battlefield itself became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to understand the events, with locals recalling the fires that burned throughout the day and the soldiers who passed through their homes. In official British histories, the battle became both a cautionary episode and a testament to resilience. In German accounts, it became a symbol of armored excellence, a moment when the Tiger's reputation reached its peak. The legend of Wittmann grew, shaped as much by wartime propaganda as by his undeniable tactical achievements. And yet, beyond all interpretations, the truth endures in the wreckage left behind. An armored clash that began with a devastating ambush, stretched into fierce urban fighting, evolved into a desperate defensive stand, and then dissolved into a night withdrawal that left behind more questions than answers. In the final measure, the legacy of Villers-Bocage was greater than the tactical map it altered. Its imprint would echo across the remainder of the Normandy campaign and through the decades that followed, shaping perceptions of armored warfare for generations. The echoes of battle often fade as time presses onward, yet certain clashes leave an imprint that refuses to dissipate. The events at Villers-Bocage on 13th of June 1944 created precisely such a mark. A fusion of shock, admiration, fear, and fascination that embedded itself deep within the story of armored warfare. When the smoke cleared and the last wounded were evacuated from the hedgerows west of the town, the conflict entered a second life, one not fought with metal and fire, but with memory, analysis, and myth. In the weeks following the battle, stories of the spectacular ambush spread through Allied formations across Normandy. Tank crews operating miles from Villers-Bocage heard accounts from survivors describing the sudden emergence of a heavy German tank amidst a halted column, the deafening roar of the 88mm gun at point-blank range, and the chilling sight of British vehicles igniting one after another along the ridge. These stories circulated quickly because they struck at an underlying anxiety within Allied units. The fear of an enemy armored vehicle whose protection and firepower exceeded nearly everything they had encountered before. This anxiety, though powerful, did not translate into paralysis. If anything, it forced a renewed vigilance among crews who had previously believed the Bocage to be less favorable to heavy German armor. Firefly commanders began refining firing lanes through hedgerows, studying the angles at which their 17-pounder guns could deliver decisive blows. Infantry sections drilled counter-armor tactics with renewed urgency, focusing on striking weak points rather than attempting frontal engagements. Engineers improved observation posts and coordinated more tightly with air support units. The shadow cast by the Tiger became a catalyst for innovation, prompting commanders to adapt, refine, and rethink. Across the German lines, the perception of the Tiger's prowess grew even faster. Soldiers in other divisions heard of the events at Villers-Bocage almost immediately. The narrative depicted a single heavy tank charging through a British brigade like an unstoppable force of nature. Wittmann's reputation, already established on the Eastern Front, now soared into near-legendary status. Tiger crews elsewhere in Normandy held the battle up as proof of the machine's unrivaled battlefield potential. It reinforced the morale of tankers who faced overwhelming Allied material superiority but carried faith in the quality of their own vehicles. German propaganda amplified these sentiments deliberately. Goebbels' ministry recognized the symbolic power of one battle turning against overwhelming odds. Newspapers published embellished accounts of the ambush. Radio broadcasts described Wittmann's bold maneuvers in dramatic detail. The Tiger became the mechanized embodiment of German defiance, an iron fist resisting the Allied advance. These portrayals reached far beyond the battlefield, shaping the perceptions of civilians, officers, and foreign observers alike. Yet the legacy of Villers-Bocage extended well beyond the psychological sphere. Military analysts after the war examined the ambush again and again. They studied the terrain around Point 213, the narrow approaches into the town, and the sunken lanes that concealed Tiger movements. They dissected the decisions made by British officers, the vulnerabilities inherent in pausing an armored column in exposed terrain, and the consequences of insufficient reconnaissance. These studies shaped doctrines across multiple nations in the decades that followed. Manuals on armored warfare referenced Villers-Bocage as a case study in the value of concealment, the peril of overconfidence, and the importance of combined arms coordination. The Tiger Eye itself became an object of intense study. Engineers and historians analyzed its armor layout, suspension system, turret design, and the fearsome efficiency of the KWK-36 gun. Museums acquired surviving examples. Bovington's Tiger 131, captured in Tunisia, became a centerpiece, drawing veterans who wanted to see up close the machine whose reputation had so profoundly influenced their wartime experiences. Young tank officers who trained in the decades after the war often heard references to Villers-Bocage during lectures on battlefield awareness and ambush potential. Meanwhile, in the British Army, the battle assumed a dual legacy. On one hand, it underscored the resilience of the Desert Rats during the defensive stand west of the town, showcasing their determination against repeated counterattacks. On the other hand, it prompted introspection regarding tactical planning. The loss of vehicles on Point 213 and the subsequent street fight forced planners to re-evaluate how fast-moving armored units should advance in restrictive environments. Officers wrote detailed accounts to ensure that future formations would not fall prey to similar circumstances. For the local population of Villers-Bocage, the legacy was etched into the streets themselves. Residents returned to their homes to find entire blocks destroyed by shells, fires, and collapsing walls. The mark of the Tiger's shells remained visible on certain structures long after the war ended. Farmers discovered fragments of armor in their fields for years. Children grew up hearing stories from parents who had witnessed the thunder of tanks rolling past their doorsteps and the shattering explosions that followed. As decades passed, Villers-Bocage became a point of interest for military historians, enthusiasts, and travelers. Guidebooks directed visitors to the sites of the ambush, the street battles, and the defensive perimeter where the British made their stand. Local museums displayed maps, photographs, and relics recovered from the fields. The names of the units that fought there, 4th County of London Yeomanry, Rifle Brigade, Panzer Lehr Division, and the 101st SS Heavy Panzer Battalion, became intertwined with the identity of the region. Michael Wittmann, for better and worse, became inseparable from the legacy of Villers-Bocage. Admirers hailed him as one of history's most capable tank commanders. Critics pointed out that circumstances favored him greatly during the ambush. Scholars continued debating how many vehicles his crew destroyed, how much support he had, and how propaganda inflated the results. Regardless of these debates, Wittmann's name remained attached to the event in every retelling. His death in August 1944, killed in another fierce tank engagement, left Villers-Bocage as one of his final and most dramatic battlefield actions. The clash also influenced popular culture. Documentaries, books, and war games recreated the events in meticulous detail. Television programs narrated the ambush using maps, diagrams, and reenactments. Hobbyists built scale models depicting the column on point 213 or the Tigers entering the town. Writers used the battle as inspiration for fictional accounts that explored the tension and chaos of armored warfare. With every new generation, the story resurfaced, each time adding another layer to the legacy. What made the battle endure so strongly in collective memory was not merely the destruction wrought by one tank or the fierce fighting within the town. It was the convergence of elements rarely found so dramatically intertwined. A bold operational gamble, a sudden reversal, an iconic weapon system, and the vivid contrast between confidence and catastrophe. Such episodes often become symbolic lenses through which entire campaigns are viewed. For the Allied forces in Normandy, Villers-Bocage was a stern reminder that the enemy remained capable of fierce resistance even when pressured on multiple fronts. For the German military, it served as proof, however fleeting, that skill and audacity could still produce dramatic results against numerically superior opponents. For historians, the battle offered endless material for analysis. In the end, the legacy of Villers-Bocage lies in its ability to evoke both the brutal reality of armored combat and the human stories within it. Tank crews who fought there remembered the smell of cordite hanging in the humid summer air, the tremor of the earth under moving armor, and the confusion that accompanied each shift in the battle's tempo. Infantrymen recalled sprinting between doorways in the town, the sting of mortar fragments, and the resolve that carried them through the final defensive stand. Civilians remembered roaring engines and collapsing walls. The Tiger's roar on that June day became more than a mechanical sound. It became a symbol, a representation of the fearsome power a single armored machine could wield under the right circumstances. It became a warning taught in military academies about the danger of assuming safety where none exists. It became a story retold across continents by veterans who survived similar clashes. And so, long after the battle's smoke drifted away into the calm Normandy sky, the legacy of the Tiger at Villers-Bocage continued to grow, shaping how the world understood the possibilities and perils of armored warfare.